This is the story of Noah Calloway and his wife Lauren Calloway. They had been married for 9 years, long enough that their routines had calcified into something resembling comfort, and short enough that they still occasionally mistook familiarity for love. Lauren was a woman who needed to be seen, not in the shallow way people sometimes mean that, but in the way that a person who grew up invisible in a crowded house carries a hunger into every room they enter. Noah was the kind of man who showed love through constancy, through presence, through the quiet language of staying, and had never fully understood that for Lauren, staying was not the same as being there. The tension between them had never been loud. It had been the kind that lives in pauses, in the second before someone decides not to say the thing they almost said. What unravels here is not a marriage destroyed by one catastrophic choice, but one that had been quietly unmade, thread by thread, over years of two people loving each other in languages the other had stopped trying to learn. The Tuesday Lauren disappeared was not a remarkable day, which is perhaps why Noah would return to it so often afterward, examining its ordinary surface for the fault lines he must have missed. He had made coffee that morning, the good kind, with the beans her sister had brought back from Portland, and Lauren had stood at the kitchen counter reading something on her phone with the particular stillness of a person who doesn't want to be asked what they're reading. He'd noticed it. He had noticed it the way you notice a small crack in a wall and then don't mention it because the wall is still standing. "You're working late tonight?" she'd asked, not looking up. "Should be home by 7. He'd set her mug beside her hand rather than handing it to her directly, a habit so ingrained he'd stopped being aware of it. The half-inch of space between the mug and her fingers. A small geography. "Okay," she said. "Just that." They had built a life that, from the outside, appeared entirely solid. A house in a quiet neighborhood outside of Hartford with a yard that Noah tended on Saturdays, and a kitchen Lauren had remodeled 2 years ago into something bright and functional, all white tile and warm wood. They had friends, mostly couples, mostly people they'd accumulated through proximity rather than genuine choosing. They went to dinners and said the right things and drove home in a silence that was not unfriendly exactly, but had texture to it. Their daughter, Maisie, was 7, and she was the living proof that they had, at some point, been people who moved toward each other rather than around each other. Maisie had Lauren's directness and Noah's patience, which seemed like a generous arrangement. She was currently in a phase of drawing elaborate maps of imaginary countries and taping them to her bedroom wall, a habit Noah found quietly heartbreaking in its beauty. In the evenings when Noah came home at 7 or 7:15, Lauren was usually in the living room with a glass of wine and her laptop, the television on something she wasn't really watching. They would talk about Misa's day. They would cover the administrative territory of a shared life, the dentist appointment, the bill that needed attention, whether they needed more olive oil, and then the evening would soften into separate corners, Lauren on her laptop, Noah reading or cleaning up the kitchen, because cleaning the kitchen had become a way of moving his hands when his mind wanted to be still. It wasn't unhappiness exactly. It was something quieter and in some ways more difficult to name, the low, continuous hum of two people who had once chosen each other with clarity and now moved through their shared life with something closer to momentum than intention. Their friend couple, the Aldersons, Dana and Patrick, came for dinner that Friday, 4 days before Lauren left. Dana and Lauren had been close since their early 30s, the kind of friendship built on wine and candor and the mutual recognition of women who'd once wanted very different lives than the ones they were living. Patrick was loud in the good-natured way of a man who had always been liked without trying, and Noah genuinely enjoyed him, the relief of a person who filled rooms without demanding anything from them. Over dinner, Lauren had been particularly alive. She told a story about something that had happened at her firm. She was a project manager at an architecture company, good at her job in the methodical, thorough way that didn't always get celebrated. And she'd told it well, leaning forward, her hands moving, and Dana had laughed and said, "God, you should have been a litigator," and Lauren had looked briefly, privately pleased in a way Noah recognized as rare. He'd watched her from across the table with a feeling he couldn't entirely parse, something adjacent to pride and something adjacent to distance. Later, washing dishes while Lauren walked Dana to her car, Patrick had stood in the kitchen doorway with the beer and said almost offhandedly, "She seems good lately." Lauren, lighter. Noah had kept his eyes on the water. "Yeah," he said. "She does." The word lately sat in the room between them like a quiet question neither of them asked. He thought about it again on Tuesday morning, standing at the kitchen counter after Lauren had taken Maisie to school, and then, he would later learn, not gone to work. The coffee going cold in the mug he'd sat beside her empty space. She didn't come home Tuesday evening. He called at 7:30. Voicemail. He told himself traffic, told himself a work thing, and made Maisie dinner and helped her with a geography worksheet about river systems, and tried not to let the quality of his attention betray anything. Maisie was perceptive in the unnerving way of children who have learned to read adult atmospheres. She'd asked once, months ago, "Are you and Mom tired of each other?" And Noah had answered too quickly, too reassuringly, which had probably told her more than silence would have. At 9:15, he texted, "Hey, everything okay? Maisie's asking about you." The message showed as delivered, not read. He sat in the living room in the particular stillness of someone who is afraid to move too quickly toward a conclusion. He picked up his book. He read the same page 4 times. He thought about what Patrick had said, lighter, as though Lauren had been carrying something and had set it down somewhere Noah didn't know about. By Wednesday morning, she still hadn't called, and something in him shifted from worry into a different register, something colder, more deliberate. He called her office. The woman who answered told him Lauren had taken a few days of personal leave, which had been approved the previous week. He stood in the driveway for a long time after hanging up, keys in his hand. That afternoon, while Maisie was at school, he began, not in the frantic, ransacking way of someone who has lost control, but with the quiet, methodical care of a man who had decided to know, to look at things he had previously decided not to look at: credit card statements, calendar entries, the spare email account Lauren used for subscription stuff that she'd mentioned once, and he'd had the password to for years, saved in a browser he rarely used. What he found didn't arrive like a blow. It arrived the way cold arrives, gradually and then completely. There were dinner reservations, hotel confirmations, twice. Once for a weekend she'd told him was a work conference in Boston, once for a night she'd said she was staying at Dana's after a concert. Messages in a thread she'd apparently forgotten existed in that secondary email from a name he didn't recognize, then did recognize, Marcus Hale, a name he'd heard Lauren mention in the abstract way people mention professional connections, her ex-business school classmate, a person she ran into occasionally. The messages were not graphic. They were somehow worse than graphic. They were intimate in the specific, careful way of two people who have constructed a private world together. Small references he couldn't fully decode. The shape of a closeness built over time. He sat with the laptop open for an hour and 20 minutes, and did not cry and did not make any phone calls. He went and picked up Maisie from school, and they stopped for ice cream because it was warm and she wanted something with sprinkles. He watched her eat it with the focused joy of a child who lives entirely in the present moment and felt something inside his chest that he couldn't name and didn't try to. That evening, after Maisie was asleep, he called Dana, Noah. Her voice immediately careful. "Did you know?" A silence. A particular kind of silence. Not empty but dense, weighted with whatever decision was happening on the other end of the line. "Not everything," she said finally, "but something." "Noah, I'm not asking you to explain it," he said. "I'm asking you to tell me she's okay, physically." Another pause. "She's okay." Dana stopped. "I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." He thanked her and ended the call and sat in the kitchen with the lights on, not thinking exactly, or thinking too much to organize it into thoughts. He looked at the wall across from him, the one Maisie had taped a map to that had fallen and he'd retaped crookedly and never straightened. He looked at it for a long time. Then quietly into the still kitchen he said, "I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something." The lamp flickered. Or maybe didn't. The house was simply quiet, and the words had come out of him like a small, strange exhaust, absurd and misplaced, and he was immediately not sure why he'd said them. Only that something in the silence had felt like an audience, like someone watching, and the impulse had moved through him before sense could stop it. He shook his head slightly. Maisie's map was still crooked on the wall. He went to bed. She came back on Sunday. He heard her key in the lock at mid-morning while Maisie was at his mother's, which he'd arranged 3 days ago. Quietly, without announcing why, Lauren came in carrying a bag, wearing the slightly heightened air of a person who has prepared for a difficult conversation and arrived before it, which gave her a particular energy, preemptive, already somewhat defensive, dressed in the clothes of someone who expects to be asked to explain herself and has decided to do so on her own terms. She set her bag down and looked at him with something that was almost composed. "I needed time," she said. "I know that's not, sit down, Lauren." She did, which surprised him slightly. He could tell from the slight recalibration in her expression that she'd expected something louder, something she could push against. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten 9 years of meals. He'd made coffee and he poured her a cup without asking, and she wrapped her hands around it the way she always did. "I know about Marcus," he said. She looked at her cup, not a collapse, more a settling, like something that had been held at tension finally releasing. "How long?" he asked. "Noah, I'm not asking because I want to be hurt by the answer. I'm asking because I need to understand the actual scope of what I'm looking at." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, about 18 months, on and off." It wasn't. She stopped herself. He watched her choose not to finish that sentence, which he respected more than if she had. "Are you in love with him?" The pause was its own answer. Even before she spoke, "I don't know. I think I felt something with him I'd stopped feeling here." "That's not an excuse." "I know it isn't. What had you stopped feeling?" She looked at him then, and something in her face shifted into something more real. "Seem," she said, "which I know isn't fair to say because I know you love me and I know you try. But Noah, we've been side by side for years, and I couldn't tell you the last time I felt like you actually looked at me. Not at the house or Maisie or the logistics of everything. At me." He didn't argue with it. He sat with it, which was perhaps not what she expected. "You're right," he said. "I don't think you're wrong about that." She blinked. "I'm not saying it justifies it," he continued. "I'm saying I'm not going to pretend you invented the problem. The problem was real. What you did with it is something else." She set her coffee down. "So what does that mean, for us?" "I don't know yet." He looked at her steadily. "But I need you to understand something. When you walked in here, you walked in ready to manage this. I could see it on you. And I need you to let go of that. I'm not something to manage right now." Something crossed her face, the thing underneath the composure. It was grief or something grief adjacent, and it made her look younger and more like herself than she had in the conversation so far. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," he said. "Not to threaten you, because I needed to understand my options. I thought you should know that." The color shifted slightly in her face. "I haven't made any decisions," he said, "but I've stopped waiting to make them." They did not separate immediately. This surprised both of them in different ways. Lauren had perhaps expected the confrontation to resolve into one of two forms, reconciliation or rupture. She had not anticipated the long, unresolved middle they moved into instead, a kind of suspended state in which they continued to share the house, continued to parent Maisie with a coordination that functioned almost too well, and circled each other with the careful courtesy of two people who have seen the inside of something and don't know yet what to do with what they've seen. She tried in those months. He recognized her trying and was not unmoved by it. She began coming home earlier. She put her phone face down on the table at dinner, which was small, but he noticed it. She asked him questions, real ones, not the administrative kind, about his work, his thoughts, what he'd been reading. He answered honestly, and there was something both hopeful and faintly melancholy in those conversations. like two people attempting to have a first date after having been married for 9 years, aware of both the possibility and the distance. What Lauren had not fully reckoned with was that her understanding of the problem was still framed around herself, around her needs unmet, her hunger for being seen, the slow suffocation genuinely felt in the marriage's quieter years. All of this was real, but she had arranged the narrative such that Noah's distance was a cause and her choices were a response, a sequence that allowed her a kind of passive position in the story. She didn't lie about this to people. She simply narrated it to herself in a particular order. She told Dana once, about 3 months in, he admitted he'd stopped seeing me. He said I wasn't wrong about that. Dana was quiet for a moment. He said that wasn't an excuse for it. I know that. I'm just. Dana paused. You keep talking about what was missing. I think Noah might have already moved somewhere you haven't looked yet. Lauren didn't ask her to explain that. Noah, for his part, was doing something she couldn't quite track. He had withdrawn not in the punishing way of a man staging a coldness, but in the interior way of someone who was genuinely turned inward. He was, in some fundamental sense, grieving. Not the marriage exactly, but something about himself and the years of it, and the ways he had been absent even while present. The 10,000 small moments he had chosen task over contact had set a mug beside her hand instead of into it. He was not flagellating himself, he was simply counting. He started seeing a therapist in February, a calm, white-haired man named Dr. Marsh, who had the particular gift of asking questions that made Noah feel he was arriving at answers himself. He talked about his father, who had loved his family with absolute devotion and almost no emotional vocabulary, who had kept the yard and paid the bills and shown up to every school play and never once said what he felt about anything. Noah had believed for most of his adult life that he'd broken that pattern. He was beginning to understand that he had replicated it with better table manners. One evening in March, Maisie showed him her latest map, a country she'd named Valeria, with a mountain range in the east and a river called the Tessamine running through its center. She had written in careful 7-year-old letters a list of laws for Valoria, which included no one has to eat soup if they don't want to, and everyone gets to say what they're scared of without being laughed at. Noah read the list twice. His daughter watched his face. That last one, he said. That's the important one. She nodded gravely, as though she'd been waiting for him to figure that out. They had the final conversation on a Thursday evening in April, 14 months after Lauren came back. Maisie was at a sleepover. Noah had made pasta. Simple, the kind with lemon and parmesan he'd started making in the last year, and they'd eaten it mostly in the low, comfortable silence that had become, strangely, less tense than the careful conversation attempts of earlier months. Something had eased between them, which made what was coming harder and also more honest. After dinner, Lauren poured wine and Noah left his glass untouched, and she said, I've been thinking about us, about what's possible. He looked at her across the table. The kitchen light above them made everything warm, amber, the particular light of a house that has been lived in. I have too, he said. I think, she started, then redirected. I want to know if you're still in this. Because I am. I want to be. I've been trying. I know you have. Then, Lauren? His voice wasn't cold and it wasn't hard. It was the voice of someone saying something they've spent a long time arriving at. I think you have been trying. I believe that. And I want you to know, genuinely, that I understand what happened more than you might think. I understand the loneliness in this marriage was real. I understand I was absent in ways I didn't recognize. I've spent the better part of a year looking at that clearly. She was very still. But I've also come to understand something else, he said. Trying isn't the same as changing. And I've been waiting, honestly waiting, not strategically, to feel something shift. Not just in your behavior, but in how it actually feels to be in the room with you. And what I feel is, he paused, not for effect, but because he was being precise. I feel compassion. I feel a long history of something real. But I don't feel like your husband anymore. I haven't, for a while. And I think we've both known it. The wine glass in her hand, the way she set it down. "I've started looking at apartments," he said. "For me. I think it should be me who moves. For Maisie's sake, she should stay in the house. We should do this carefully for her." Lauren was quiet for a long moment. Something in her face was undergoing a process he recognized. The slow release of a version of reality she'd been maintaining. She had expected, he thought, that this conversation would go differently, that her trying would be enough, or that she could negotiate his ambivalence if she could only find the right argument, the right acknowledgement, the right version of herself to present. She was understanding, he thought, that there was no argument available. "Was there ever a point," she said, and her voice was different now, stripped of its navigation, "when I could have—" "I don't know," he said. "Probably. Yes. Before everything, before I understood what had been happening, there was a version of this that could have been different. But that's not really where we are anymore." "I know," she said quietly. They sat for a moment in the amber light of the kitchen they had built together, in the house that was full of the accumulated evidence of a shared life. The wall where Maisie's maps had all been taped, the cabinet Lauren had painted the wrong shade of blue, and they both decided to keep, the small chips and scuffs of years. "I do love you," Noah said. "I want you to know that isn't in question. I just don't think love is the same as the right thing anymore." Lauren looked down at the table. Then, after a long moment, "I think I understand that. I think I'm only just understanding what I did to this. Not a confession, not an apology exactly. More like a person finally choosing to see something they'd been angling away from for years." He nodded. They didn't hug, they didn't argue. After a while, Lauren took her wineglass to the living room, and Noah washed the dishes in the quiet kitchen, the warm light overhead, his hands in the water, and let it all be what it was. Outside, the neighborhood was going dark, in the ordinary April way, porch lights coming on, a dog somewhere, the particular smell of spring, and someone's early barbecue. A world continuing its business with complete indifference to the large, quiet thing that had just finished happening inside one house on one street. Noah dried his hands. He stood for a moment at the kitchen window and looked at the dark yard. The yard he'd tended for 9 years on Saturdays. The grass coming back now after winter, pale green and new and not yet itself. He thought of Maisie's law. Everyone gets to say what they're scared of without being laughed at. He turned off the kitchen light and went to his study and began, quietly, to look at apartments. Some marriages don't end because love disappears. Some end because two people finally stop being afraid of what they already know.